The Forest Service is amending the Northwest Forest Plan, the visionary policy enacted in 1994 that curtailed much of the reckless old growth clear cutting that happened for decades before. So tonight we're going to cover the background and analysis of the current proposal and what happens next for our Pacific Northwest forests. My name is Chandra Legui. I'm Oregon Wild Senior Conservation Advocate, and I'll be one of the presenters for the webcast this evening. And tonight I'm joined by my colleagues Lauren Anderson, Oregon Wild's Climate Forests Program Manager, and John Purcell, our staff attorney. So prepared to get educated on tonight's program. So Erin went over a few of the housekeeping things, and again, we'll collect questions throughout the presentation and get to those at the end. And then before we go further, I want to offer some gratitude to the land and the forest that we're discussing tonight, and for those who have lived here in Oregon since time immemorial. I want to acknowledge the continuing presence of Indigenous peoples on the land today. This map shows some of the overlapping areas where people have lived, different peoples have lived and continue to. The history of tribes in Oregon is complex and nuanced and includes a lot of colonial legacies and wrongdoings like forced removal from these public lands. And they have long-lasting effects on both the people and the landscape. So it's important to acknowledge this, but also continue to do meaningful work by supporting Indigenous peoples in the present, respecting and uplifting tribal sovereignty, and taking action. So we're going to get started with some background on our wonderful Northwest forests. The forest ecosystems are an integral part of Oregon Wild's work for the past 50 years. And that's no wonder. Forests make up half of Oregon. And about half of that is on public lands, federal public lands, where we work most. So protecting and restoring healthy forest ecosystems are key to achieving many of Oregon Wild's goals to protect our wildlands, wildlife, and waters. In particular, we do tend to focus a lot on mature and old growth forests, forests that have, for the most part, not been logged extensively and have developed naturally for about a century or more. These forests are the best wildlife habitat for many, many species, and we'll talk more about those species later. They protect and filter our watersheds. These forests have evolved with fire and have adaptations that make them resistant and resilient in the face of this natural disturbance. And they improve our quality of life in immeasurably more ways. One of the most important is that they sequester and store vast amounts of carbon, making them one of our most vital natural climate solutions. And Lauren will talk a bit more about that later. So Western Oregon's lush, diverse forest ecosystems once covered the Coast Range, the Cascades, and the Siskiyou Mountains. But unfortunately, over the last century, mature and old growth forests across our region have been really drastically altered by unsustainable and damaging logging. Clear cuts and roads across many thousands of acres of our public lands and national forests have led to fragmented wildlife habitat, as you can see in this image of the Willamette National Forest back in the early 90s, and all those clear cuts. Degraded water quality and stream health, and really just a fraction of the vast ancient forest that once covered this temperate rainforest region. And the consequences of those decades of overlogging include that species that depend on old growth forests and the streams that flow through them in the Pacific Northwest were listed under the Endangered Species Act. Yes, we are talking about the northern spotted owl, marbled murrelet, and several Pacific salmon species. Enter the Northwest Forest Plan. So the Northwest Forest Plan was a compromise that was developed in the early 90s as an attempt to strike a balance between ongoing logging and what was perceived as a really vital economy and part of our economy, and protecting habitat for the species that were listed and that need these forests to survive. The plan covered 24 million acres of federal forests in Western Washington, Western Oregon, and Northwest California. It's the range of the northern spotted owl. And it included 17 national forests You can see those labeled on the map here, as well as about 2.5 million acres of forests in Oregon managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The plan laid out sort of a new zoning scheme that defined areas for protecting and restoring old growth habitat, that were designated as streamside areas to protect water quality and salmon habitat. The plan set strong standards for restoring forests and watersheds that had been previously logged, and then also set targets and areas for ongoing timber harvest. One thing it did not do, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, is include all of the mature and old growth forests, that wildlife habitat in the protected reserve areas. There are about 1 million acres that were included in what we call matrix areas. And let me do a little bit of vocabulary here for you. Most people may have heard some of these, and if we slip into saying some of these, just a little background on some of the zoning that went into the Northwest Forest Plan. So this map kind of shows, and I don't expect you to be able to zoom in and see this really, but you can see that there's lots of different colors. So those are the different zones that were defined under the Northwest Forest Plan, including those late successional reserves, the lazy Sasquatch areas, the late successional reserves, LSRs, that were designated for protecting and recovering old forest habitat. And within LSRs, forests that were older than 80 years were protected from logging unless it would benefit the creation of those older forest habitat conditions. Younger stands of forests within LSRs could be thinned as long as it would eventually benefit those old growth conditions. Riparian reserves are those areas along streams that were set aside to protect water quality and habitat, where some management is still allowed. And then matrix are the areas in between the reserves where more logging is allowed, that was meant to generate the targeted volume of timber set by the Forest Service, and didn't have any age limits on how old the trees, how old trees could be when they're logged. There are a few other areas like adaptive management areas that were meant to be sort of experimental areas to explore different ways of management. A few other things defined in the Northwest Forest Plan were the aquatic conservation strategy and key watersheds that were basically guidance for attaining the water quality and habitat goals in the riparian reserves. And then survey and manage, which was a requirement to look for and protect rare species if they were found in the path of old forest logging that might continue under the Northwest Forest Plan. So if those critters like red tree voles were found, then they would be given a buffer, and so they wouldn't be disturbed by logging. So there's a little bit of vocab for you. So Oregon Wild has generally been a big supporter of the Northwest Forest Plan. It immediately slowed the old growth liquidation that had been going on for decades. It brought some improved management to federal forests within the range of the owl. And there's been a lot of progress made in the last 30 years towards restoring some of the damage done by unsustainable logging and road building. There's water quality and salmon habitat has been improved. And logging in mature and old growth forests generally was put on the back burner in order to focus on the plantations that had been replanted from previous decades. Perhaps most importantly, with our modern climate crisis, the national forests, which had been emitting vast amounts of carbon under the previous logging regime, became carbon sinks rather than sources. So a side benefit that people didn't necessarily know about when they put this plan in place. However, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this plan is far from perfect. Not all of the mature and old growth forests that remained after decades of logging were included in the reserve areas. And so logging of mature and old growth forests is still allowed in the matrix areas. There's other places that are ecologically critical and sensitive where logging and road building is still allowed as well. So you might have heard of the Flat Country Project on the Willamette National Forest or the Grasshopper Project on the Mount Hood. Both are logging projects within the Northwest Forest Plan area that include logging in old forests because they happen to be in the matrix. So we don't think that because we can is a good enough reason to log our few remaining older forests. And so we found that there were plenty of good arguments to push back on those projects that the Forest Service was proposing a few years ago. And so through litigation and through grassroots pressure, we've been working to put a stop to those particular sales. And those are just two examples of some that have been planned and implemented over the last 30 years under the Northwest Forest Plan, because some of our older forests were left in the matrix and not actually protected in reserves. So flat country, by the way, was withdrawn by the Forest Service in late 2022. And the Grasshopper project is kind of still pending because of a lawsuit that we filed. So, a lot has changed in 30 years. And so there definitely are things that could be addressed under a change to the Northwest Forest Plan. I mean, I know I've changed a lot since 1994. And there's, new information from monitoring reports and requirements under the Endangered Species Act that, for example, that have come out since 1994. The Bureau of Land Management's 2.5 million acres that were included in the Northwest Forest Plan originally are no longer part of that same zoning scheme. Today, we know a lot more about the value of forests for carbon storage and climate adaptation that we didn't really know or wasn't included in the Northwest Forest Plan's development. Unfortunately, we're still losing habitat for threatened species through logging. We are seeing more climate-fueled wildfire and their impacts increasing across the landscape. And we're still seeing northern spotted owls. Our northern spotted owls are still imperiled in large part because of barred owl competition, as well as continued habitat loss. And that was something that was not considered in the Northwest Forest Plan. And last but not least here, when the forest plan was developed, and it was developed quickly, the tribes in the Pacific Northwest who had been here and managing the land and understanding it were not included or considered in any way. And that's definitely something that is a change that we need to make moving forward. So over the last 30 years, there have definitely been efforts to make changes to the Northwest Forest Plan. Often those came in the form of attacks on the very protections and guidelines under the plan that we supported. For example, the Survey and Manage program to look for rare species. We've been successful in fending off a lot of those weakened protections. But one major loss was with the Bureau of Land Management's new management plans. If anyone remembers the acronym WOPR, the Western Oregon Plan revisions that went on in the 2000s, which essentially removed those more than 2 million acres from the conservation framework of the Northwest Forest Plan, shrinking riparian reserves and allowing more intense logging, both inside and outside reserves. In 2015, a full-scale plan revision process for the Northwest Forest Plan was launched. There was public engagement, there were a few big reports that came out, but then ultimately that effort was shelved when Trump came into office in 2017. Then last year, a more focused plan amendment process. So revision would kind of be an complete overhaul, whereas an amendment would be more targeted. So last year, a plan amendment process was proposed and a federal advisory committee was convened to inform potential amendments to the Northwest Forest Plan. And if you've been following this at all, this is where you've been, over the last year, you've gotten alerts from Oregon Wild and any other groups that have been working in this area to let you know how that's progressed. So where we are now is that the Forest Service, with the help of that federal advisory committee, developed a proposal for, just sort of a broad proposal of what they might do in a forest plan amendment. And so many of you may have commented on the scoping process. Last summer, some pretty comprehensive recommendations from the Federal Advisory Committee were released and submitted to the Forest Service. And then just last month, the draft environmental impact statement for the amendment was issued. So here's kind of a timeline this is from the Forest Service, of some of the steps and where we are now. I should note that there is coordination and consultation with tribes all along this way, and there were and those voices were also present on the Federal Advisory Committee. So where we are now is that the draft amendment has been published, and there are a few next steps coming up, and we'll get into what that means and how you all can get involved in over the next few minutes. So I'm going to turn it over to John Purcell, Oregon Wild Staff Attorney, to get into the meat of what is in this proposal. And again, just a reminder to enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end. All right, take it away, John.
Great, thank you, Chandra. So yes, as Chandra mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit about what the Forest Service has actually proposed in terms of amending the Northwest Forest Plan. As Chandra mentioned, in mid-November, the Forest Service released a draft environmental impact statement, or draft EIS, that outlined 4 alternatives that the Forest Service is considering in terms of amending the Northwest Forest Plan. I'm going to give an overview of what those 4 alternatives are to start. Alternative A is what they call the no action alternative, and that would essentially keep the Northwest Forest Plan as it is. Now, under the National Environmental Policy Act, the agency's required to consider no action and compare and contrast the effects of a range of action alternatives against the effects of doing nothing or not changing anything. So we have that no action alternative. And then alternative B is the Forest Service's proposed action, and it in large part mirrors the recommendations of the Federal Advisory Committee that the Forest Service convened, and that committee issued recommendations this past July. So this proposed action would do a number of things. It would change the stand age restriction for logging in moist or wetter late successional reserves, LSRs, from 80 years to 120 years. And that's a significant shift, but the Forest Service hasn't quite yet provided the scientific explanation for that, other than that time has passed since the original Northwest Forest Plan was adopted. And, at the time of the Northwest Forest Plan's adoption in 1994, scientists had honed in on 80 years as the point at which forest stands begin to display maturity, or the structural complexities of late successional forests. They have significant numbers of snags, significant amounts of down wood, a mix of species, and layered canopies. Now, there's no real new science that shows these complexities suddenly begin at 120 years. So in these late successional reserves in particular, this redefining of mature as starting at 120 is really alarming. And the Forest Service now calls stands under the age of 120 young. So alternative B would also include a new purpose for which the Forest Service can authorize logging in these moist late successional reserves. Instead of limiting active management in LSRs to treatments that accelerate the development of late successional characteristics, the habitat needed by spotted owls and marbled murrelets, the Forest Service would now also allow logging in these LSRs to promote habitat for species that depend on younger forests. Now, there's no real shortage of younger forest habitat across the Pacific Northwest. If you look at the industrial logging practices we see on state and private forest lands and what happens from natural disturbances like windstorms and fires. But there does remain a severe deficit of old growth on our landscape. Alternative B, this proposed action also would increase logging across all dry forests, regardless of land use allocation. And that means in both dry LSRs and dry matrix stands. And the goal stated by the Forest Service is to treat or log nearly 1 million acres of these dry forests over 15 years. And now, shifting to moist or wetter matrix stands. Matrix, again, are those lands that were not put into reserves but were left open to commercial logging in the original Northwest Forest Plan. In these wetter matrix stands, under this proposal, the Forest Service would allow any stands established after 1905 to be intensively logged, while stands established between 1825 and 1905 would also be open to logging under a suite of justifications. So the only real protection that the Forest Service would give to the matrix stands would be stands established before 1825. So those are really old stands that are still going to be open to logging under this proposal. Now, Alternative C would place more emphasis on natural processes to accomplish ecological objectives. And it would also retain that 80-year limit on logging in LSRs, but it would still allow logging within those LSRs for younger forest-dependent species and make that shift to stand establishment dates in moist matrix stands. Now, the last alternative, Alternative D, would give the Forest Service the greatest amount of flexibility and place the greatest emphasis on active management or logging to accomplish objectives. And this increase in commercial logging under Alternative D would be most pronounced in our moist or wetter forests. And perhaps most concerning, within certain community protection areas, rare species surveys would no longer be required before logging. So all of these action alternatives would increase logging from current levels. Alternatives B and D would double or even triple the timber outputs that we've seen on our national forest lands over the last 10 years. Okay, next slide. So at the same time as rolling back these long-standing conservation measures, the action alternatives that the Forest Service has laid out in the draft EIS would also increase tribal inclusion and co-stewardship and the integration of traditional ecological knowledge that the original Northwest Forest Plan did not include. And many of these provisions would aim to implement certain numbers of projects in conjunction with tribes within given time periods and focus on supporting and restoring culturally important plants like huckleberries, camas, beargrass, and hazel. And Oregon Wild generally supports these tribal inclusion components, and we think that they should be considered for adoption, but separate from the conservation rollbacks that the Forest Service seems to have purposefully paired them with. You know, unfortunately, important tribal inclusion components are woven into all the action alternatives. And, you know, cynically, this may have been the strategy of the Forest Service to make it difficult for the conservation community to advocate against weakening the Northwest Forest Plan without appearing to be against more meaningful tribal inclusion. But this is a false choice. The agency can and should do better at tribal engagement, consultation, and collaboration without undercutting conservation measures that remain necessary to ensure the survival and recovery of imperiled species and to support carbon storage as a natural climate solution. So keep that in mind as we dive even deeper into the concerns we've identified with the proposed amendment. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so digging in a bit more about the proposed action Alternative B. In moist or wetter late successional reserves, this is mainly on the west side of the Cascades, the Forest Service intends to open up stands as old as 120 years old to commercial logging, a change from the previous 80-year limit. And so this 40-year cohort of mature forests between the ages of 80 and 120, that's 824,000 acres that would now potentially be logged. That's a lot of forest. That's as much as nearly 8 Mount Jefferson wilderness areas. And so again, the current limit or restriction on logging stands under the age of 80, based on the point at which scientists determine late successional characteristics begin to develop. And any active management in these LSRs currently must be undertaken to accelerate the development of late successional characteristics that are needed by spotted owls and murrelets, the whole point of having this reserve system. However, as noted, the Forest Service plans to add a new justification for logging in these LSR stands to promote habitat needed by species associated with younger forests. And if that sounds totally contradictory to the very purpose of LSRs, that's because it is. It's pretty concerning. Next slide. Now, we've talked again about the matrix. These are the lands that weren't put into reserves. So in our moist or wetter matrix stands, the proposed amendment would allow intensive logging in stands established after 1905. And supposedly this date was chosen instead of 1900 to ensure that stands that naturally regenerated after big fires like the Yakul burn would receive some nominal protection. But as we'll discuss further, they're not really protected. So that's little consolation, because in stands established between 1825 and 1905, the Forest Service's proposal would theoretically restrict logging, but then the agency lists a whole bunch of exceptions that would actually allow logging at the agency's discretion, including to purportedly reduce wildfire risks. So again, the Forest Service is all but redefining longstanding understandings of what are mature and old growth forests. Under this shift to stand establishment date, stands up to 200 years old are now only considered mature, not old growth, and stands as old as 120 years are considered young. And, the Forest Service does tout these stand establishment date components as new protections within the matrix for mature and old growth, but that's not really an accurate characterization in practice or on the ground. In practice, as Chandra mentioned, the conservation community has generally held the line against destructive logging in mature and old growth stands, even in the matrix. For one thing, the Forest Service lacks an ecological justification for this type of logging. And for another, it hasn't had a social license to log old growth for decades. So we've been pretty successful at protecting these forests over the years, including the recent withdrawal of the Flat Country project on the Willamette National Forest that targeted hundreds of acres of mature and old growth stands. So in reality, these proposed changes to matrix management would ultimately just codify the Forest Service's authority to do the worst kind of logging in mature and old growth that we as a community have mostly prevented since the adoption of the original Northwest Forest Plan. Now, in addition, the Forest Service aims to treat or log at least 1/10 of all moist matrix forest stands within 10 years. And that's the equivalent of 1.3 times the size of the Salmon Huckleberry Wilderness area. And one final point on these stand establishment dates in these matrix stands. They would lock these forests into perpetual logging. These stands would never age into protection, even if an amended plan is in place for 30 years, like the original one. So as stands push well past 120 years old or 200 years old even, they remain open to logging, which would curtail, if not outright limit, any further recruitment of old growth. And we need to continually recruit old growth because we remain at a severe deficit and will continue to lose some old growth to natural disturbances like wind, fire in the years to come. Okay, next slide. Now, dry forests under this proposed amendment would also be heavily logged. There would be few distinctions between dry late successional reserves and dry matrix stands. The Forest Service aims to log at least 1/3 of all dry forests across all land allocations over 15 years. That's nearly 1 million acres, almost as much as the entire Umpqua National Forest. Now, in dry forests, the Forest Service does say it would protect or retain trees 150 years of age or older. But then again, it lists a bunch of exceptions for when those trees could be cut, including wildfire risk and operational reasons. Now, remember that the Northwest Forest Plan area encompasses the range of the northern spotted owl, and these drier forest stands provide important habitat. They're serving an important function for these imperiled species. The Forest Service says, though, that much of this habitat only exists because of fire suppression that allowed these forests to become denser with more closed canopies. And that may be the case in certain areas, but the Forest Service seems eager to sacrifice this currently existing suitable habitat, despite the ongoing deficit of suitable habitat in our wetter forests, as well as the increased competition spotted owls have from barred owls over what little habitat does remain. So overall, very troubling that this proposed amendment would increase logging in dry forests, increase logging in moist forests, and open up reserves for logging unrelated to late successional development, all with adverse impacts on habitat for the very species that the Northwest Forest Plan was originally meant to protect. And next slide. So, salvage logging. Another aspect of the proposed amendment is that it would codify authority for the Forest Service to undertake salvage logging in almost all land allocations under various justifications. And salvage logging is logging post-disturbance landscapes, so such as after fires, pretty much just to recover commercially valuable timber before it loses that commercial value. But these post-fire forests are incredibly important ecologically. They support numerous species, and even spotted owls can continue to use burn stands. And the remaining trees, living and dead, hold soils in place. They replenish nutrients to the soils, and they provide important seed sources to allow new forests to regenerate naturally. As one of my colleagues says, though, salvage logging is like peeling off a scab from a healing wound, re-injuring the ecosystem. And it also makes it more likely that any forest that does regenerate will be much more sterile, much more akin to a tree farm, not the diverse type of stands that would develop naturally if left alone. So under this proposed amendment, salvage logging would be allowed in wetter LSRs, even just because burn stands happen to be along existing system roads. No real restrictions on salvage logging would exist under the proposed plan in the matrix or dry LSRs. And another major concern is that the Forest Service would not count salvage logged acres in the areas targeted for treatment. And that means any salvage logging that occurs would be on top of the already exponential increases in logging proposed under this amendment. Okay, next slide. So on that note, under the proposed amendment, the Forest Service intends to double, if not triple, the timber outputs from our national forests. And that's double if you measure from the logging level in 2023, which was approximately 500 million board feet. Triple if you measure from the average logging level over the last 10 years, which was closer to 400 million board feet. Under this proposal, the Forest Service wants to remove between 1 and 1.3 billion board feet annually. And that's more than even the generous estimates of the original Northwest Forest Plan, which, remember, included an additional 2.5 million acres of Western Oregon BLM lands that have since been removed from the management scheme. So in other words, all the adverse impacts associated with commercial logging, the heavy machinery use, road construction, the sediment delivery to streams, the habitat loss and degradation, the spread of noxious weeds, all of that would be even more concentrated on our national forest lands. So in total, the Forest Service aims to treat 2.6 million acres across all land allocations each decade under this proposal. That's like 2.5 Mount Hood National Forests. That's a really big area. All right, next slide. So despite these pretty astronomical figures, and despite the long list of conservation rollbacks in the proposal that we've just outlined, the Forest Service claims in the draft EIS that the proposed amendment would not substantially lessen protections for species. And I don't know how that assertion passes the straight face or sniff test because, for example, by the Forest Service's own admission, spotted owls will lose habitat in drier forests under this proposal. And spotted owl and murrelet habitat will also be lost in our wetter forests by opening up that 80 to 120 year cohort in LSRs, and by allowing LSR logging for younger forest dependent species, and by allowing logging in mature and what we consider old growth stands within the matrix. Now, in addition, the vast scale of this ramped up logging will inevitably impact aquatic and riparian species like salmon. The amount of road work and heavy machinery use associated with these acreage figures will increase sediment delivery to streams, potentially delay downwoody debris delivery to streams, and likely alter riparian microclimates. And under the most aggressive alternative D, rare species surveys would no longer be required in certain areas before logging. So the lack of components in this plan to ensure the survival and recovery of imperiled species is really alarming and underscores just how far the agency has shifted from the original biodiversity conservation purpose of the Northwest Forest Plan. Next slide. So I'll wrap up my portion with a little bit of a callback to a decision from Judge Dwyer in 1994 that upheld the original Northwest Forest Plan. After the adoption of the original Northwest Forest Plan, both conservationists and the timber industry challenged it in court from different angles, of course. Conservationists argued that the plan was not protective enough, and the timber industry argued that the protections went beyond the federal agency's authority. But ultimately, Judge Dwyer, a federal judge in Washington state, upheld the original Northwest Forest Plan. But in his opinion, he noted that, quote, any more logging sales than the plan contemplates would probably violate the laws, and that whether the plan and its implementation will remain legal will depend on future events and conditions. So here we are now. One could argue that the amendment proposed by the Forest Service will result in more logging sales than the original plan contemplated, over 1 billion board feet removed from our national forests annually, whereas the original plan contemplated that amount, but it included an additional 2.6 million acres of those BLM lands that have since been removed from the plan. And in terms of future events and conditions, well, the spotted owl's population trajectory is even more dire now than it was in 1994 due to competition with barred owls and ongoing habitat loss. Yet, rather than ensure protection and recruitment of more habitat to allow the spotted owl to compete with barred owls, the Forest Service intends to ramp up logging in the current and potential habitat for that species even more. So this proposal, again, too, it's worth noting, is in some ways a high watermark for the agency, because the reality is the incoming administration might take this proposal, or likely will take this proposal, we'll see, and make it even worse. So we definitely have our work cut out for us to push back against the rollback of these bedrock environmental protections that have been in place in our Pacific Northwest National Forest for 30 years. But we're going to share with you some ways to stay engaged in the process going forward. And I will turn things over to my colleague, Lauren, for that.
Thanks so much, John. Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Anderson, and I'm the Climate Forest Program Manager with Oregon Wild. So as John highlighted, the Northwest Forest Plan is facing some pretty major threats, but it's important to know that we are ready to face them. We've spent the last 4 years with our partners around the country building a really powerful movement to push back on efforts to log mature and old growth forests, and we've gotten very good at it. Next slide. So the Climate Forest Campaign launched as an official coalition in February of 2022 and was followed 2 months later by a mature and old growth executive order from the president on Earth Day. And this was a really, really big deal. It was the first time a president has recognized both mature and old growth forests. So not just talking about protecting old growth, but also old growth of the future. It covered both BLM lands and national forests, which is especially important here in Oregon. As John mentioned, we have a lot of old growth on BLM lands. And it was framed as a climate solution, which is the first time mature and old growth forests have been pulled out and highlighted as an essential climate solution. And using that executive order as leverage, we have generated over 1 million comments from around the country, from Americans all across from many different states calling for mature and old growth protections from the threat of logging. Next slide, please. Over 130 organizations are currently participating in this effort and have come together around the issue. We've held dozens of rallies and generated hundreds of news articles on this topic. These graphs really show the power of organizing and connecting these big actions and events and rallies to media outreach. And so we've had an impact, and this has reached a lot of people. Next slide. And all of this organizing and efforts around the country has led to the nation's first national amendment on old growth forests. And the National Old Growth Amendment was focused on amending 128 national forest plans across the country. This is the first time the agency has ever attempted to do anything like this. And it was a big deal. It didn't go as far as we wanted, so that's important to note. It didn't cover mature forests, but it would have still been the first national policy focused on conserving old growth forests. However, things did not go as we'd hoped in November, as John mentioned, and this is a very serious problem for the Old Growth Amendment because of a law called the Congressional Review Act, or the CRA. If Congress were to apply the CRA to this rule, Nationwide Old Growth Amendment, after it has been finalized by a federal agency, it can undo the policy, and it can also prevent the agency from ever doing a similar policy in the future. So it could prevent us from ever doing big policies on mature and old growth forests. So it's really not worth the risk to finalize this amendment. So while we didn't get this amendment over the finish line, we did demonstrate how powerful a combined forest and climate movement can be. And Oregon Wild is doing everything we can to push back on any weakening of the Northwest Forest Plan under the incoming administration. Next slide. So it's really important to reach out to our senators and representatives, members of Congress, and tell them that they need to oppose any weakening of the Northwest Forest Plan. We don't have many safety backstops. The Nationwide Old Growth Amendment is likely not going to be finalized. The incoming administration is probably going to be looking to weaken the plan even further. And so we really need champions to step up and speak out on this issue. And so here's a link in this slide that can lead to outreach to our senators and representatives on this issue. Oregon Wild is also going to be launching a forest defense team, and we encourage folks to get engaged with that in the upcoming comment period. And it's also important to engage as much as you can in this comment period. Our temperate rainforest region under the plan is globally significant in terms of carbon storage. These forests can store more carbon per acre than the Amazon. And one of the biggest achievements of this movement and effort is the fact that we've put old growth trees on the map with climate solutions like wind turbines or solar panels. So these old growth trees are essential to fighting the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis because of the habitat they provide. Next slide. And it's also good to remember that there are other ways to get involved. Grassroots organizing and movement building is a powerful tool, as we've demonstrated with the Mature and Old Growth campaign. This is a really scary time, but we are really good at this stuff. Things like tabling at events, webinars, comment writing, workshops, and more public events to raise this issue far and wide will make a difference in the long run. Using the media as a tool, writing LTEs and op-eds to make sure your voice is heard as far and wide as possible. Getting people into the forest to see these places can be incredibly impactful. Taking photos out there and sending them to decision makers to raise this issue more is very important as well. Reaching out to your elected officials and reminding them of how important these places are is going to matter more and more as time goes on. And social media has also become a powerful tool for increasing the reach of these conversations and elevating these issues. So to close, please hang in there. This is going to be a long 4 years, and the threats to the Northwest Forest Plan are extremely serious right now. But we can protect Oregon and our old growth forests and our wildlife. Oregon Wild and our partner organizations have been doing this for 50 years now. And we have a pretty good track record of winning in the end, regardless of how many setbacks we have to get over. So thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to working as a team to make sure that this amendment does not weaken the Northwest Forest Plan.